but it will just, so they can log in, Yeah. Good afternoon to our learned speaker, our council members, distinguished invitees, and of course, our valuable participants who are present for this webinar on Sri Lanka's economic crisis and what is the way forward. So you must be wondering as to why a management accounting body, we are dealing with management accounting, financial accounting, costing and pricing and various other finance-related matters are discussing on the economy. But if you really look at today's condition of Sri Lanka, everyone is talking of economy and of course the crisis and how we can get out of it. So there is a lot of talk, but in the meantime, there has been a lot of work that has been carried out. And as you know, in a crisis, things are not going to be very favorable. There is going to be a lot of pain. There is going to be a lot of sacrifice one has to make. And of course, lot of difficulties and troubles that we are undoing. So I think that is something that we as management accountants, as financial accountants are wondering as to how this sort of situation came about. No one expected that we are going to be in this very sorry situation. After every budget, everyone claps. The chambers of commerce say very good things. We have got a lot of incentives. Our taxes have been reduced. We have got a lot of incentives. But unfortunately, they have not seen the bigger picture. They have not known that the government was borrowing money to make these facilities or incentives, subsidies to be given to the business sector and the people. So today we are now having a very big debt, maybe close upon to US dollars 100 billion. All of us know that when you are in debt, and if you are unable to pay your debt, you are in a very poor situation. You have lost all your credibility. No one will have any regard to you. The bankers will not look at you. When you go close to them, they will chase you out. So even in a country, people never thought that a government can get into this sort of situation. So unfortunately, we have come, and of course, the people who have been managing all this time, maybe, I don't know what they are saying, whether they are sad or whether they are happy, because their management has been really mismanagement. If you say that mismanagement, that is correct. We were recently there at a tax forum. The Honorable President came there. So everyone went there maybe with the idea that with the current tax increases, that they are going to get some benefit to reduce the taxes. But what did the Honorable President come and say? These are part of the reform process. There is no way that we can do anything but a part of the reform process. So then they said, of course, maybe that was one thing, because in 2019, we enjoyed some benefits which we did not ask for. But the bureaucrats, the politicians were responsible for making such a bad situation of our country. So that's why we say that there is something wrong in our system. Many people have been talking of this, that the system, yes. Because if you look at the public service, public servants are there maybe till they retire. Politicians are there maybe for 5 or 6 years. If they get re-elected, they will come in. So we now have to have a system that will work so that the country can be run in a proper way. It can be managed in a proper way. Because even if the IMF comes and gives the loans, if we do not have the proper systems to manage the money that we have got, where we use professional skills, then I'm sure that we will succeed. So we need to do a major change. And that's why we have been telling that, of course, the last, before that, after the tax increase, we had the increase in the rates of the electricity. We as a cost and management accounting body, we have set up a cost and management accounting standards board. We have found that unless proper cost records are maintained, unless these are controlled, we have efficiency, we have productivity, we do not have mismanagement, where we get the coal at the right time, and instead of using coal, we use oil, then the price the customers have to pay is much more. So today, ultimately, all these burdens have to be met by the consumer or the society. So that is why we need to tell them the right way that these things could be done. So as a professional body, we have a major role to play. We have to show the correct way. We have to tell how the correct costing can be done. The correct method by which you can cost the product. You cannot include other expenses and overheads and ask the society to pay. Society is you and me. Even in the taxation, it is the same thing. Taxation, there is one dangerous thing, because we had a webinar and what they said is that the technocrats, those who are the young lecturers in the universities, they might get attracted to higher salaries and benefits in overseas countries. So I think we need to look at this. While we are prepared to pay the higher taxes, we need to retain the professionals and the key technocrats, either for the IT industry, the BPO industry, the universities, so that we will be able to come back very fast and be able to get back to normalcy. So today we have a very eminent, I should say a professional, who is an economist. And he is going to speak to us on Sri Lanka's economic crisis and what is the way forward. Because I am sure it is very good for us to listen to a professional and an independent view. Because sometimes a lot of the views may be biased towards one side or the other. So we have Mr. Talal Rafi. He's an economist and an expert member of the World Economic Forum. You know what the World Economic Forum is. All the top business magnates are there. They will predict how the businesses are going to run and what is required. I remember them saying that technology and the digitalization are the two ways that the business world and the governments and societies could benefit. Sri Lanka too need to look at these things, because if they digitalize, because they have seen a recent success in the petroleum industry. When people were queuing up, they adopted the QR system, and that enabled a fair distribution and also doing away with queues. So if we digitalize all these heavy government departments, we will be able to get the work done without any problem. You will save the fuel. You don't have to use your vehicle. You use your computer and then get your work done. So our leaders must ensure that they are taking the correct decision, especially at this difficult time, in order that we can come out of these problems. Now, Talal Rafi is also, he's a Deloitte global economist at the Deloitte Economics Institute, and he's a member of the Deloitte Global Economist Network. He is also a senior global management consultant at Deloitte. Talal is a regular columnist for the International Monetary Fund. He has given talks globally, including the Nasdaq Center, S&P Global, and the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, and contributes regularly with thought leadership for the Davos agenda. So Davos, I think, is really one of the key areas, and where maybe even in difficult times we should go in order that we can do the right thing. His work has been published by the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, Asian Development Bank, World Economic Forum, London School of Economics, and Forbes. So I'm sure that we are very happy that a professional of the caliber of Talal Rafi is here today to speak on this very important topic on Sri Lanka's economic crisis and what is the way forward. Over to you, Talal.
Thank you very much, Professor Vatawala. That was a very warm welcome, and it's an absolute pleasure to speak here. First of all, good afternoon to everyone watching, and my special thanks to Professor Vatawala and the Governing Council for inviting me here. So I'll just start off on this very important topic. As we all know, we are going through a severe crisis like we have never been before. And we also need to look at the way forward. So in order to do that, let us, I'm going to divide my talk into a few segments. First, I will speak on where we are at the moment. Then a little bit on what's going on around the world. And after that, I'll touch on how we got here, basically in the last 2 years, the immediate reasons, and then the structural reasons. And we'll look at some of the opportunities and then challenges for the businesses, and finally come on to some of the policy recommendations. So let me start with my presentation. Thanks. Yeah, hope everyone can see this.
Yeah. Okay.
So, right. Okay, so let me start off with where we are at the moment. So as we all know, we are going through a big crisis with a triple whammy. So the first biggest problem, according to many, would be inflation. So we're currently battling inflation, which is over 50%. So when you look at some of the other countries, the Western countries, I mean, they're looking at inflation at just around over 10%. And that's taken so seriously around the world, and it's global news. But here we have much higher inflation, which is severely affecting everything. I mean, we still haven't got to, hopefully we don't get to the level of how Lebanon was or Zimbabwe is. But to prevent such a crisis, I mean, a crisis such as Zimbabwe with inflation like that, which is going to be much worse than whatever other things that we are facing, like taxes or interest rates. So as the central bank would agree, taming inflation would be a #1 priority. And at 50%, it's going to be very tough. Raw materials are going to increase in prices. Salaries may have to be adjusted by businesses. So that's the first major issue here. The second would be, as we all know, we're also facing high interest rates. So market rates going at around 30%, which is kind of impossible for a lot of businesses to function. So here again, that is another crisis that's being faced by many businesses here. Borrowing costs are high, and even no business can ever even think of taking out a loan and repaying with such high interest rates in a year. We're also facing the issue of taxation. So fair enough, because we have one of the lowest government revenue to GDP in the world. So, but at this critical time, it's always a bit very tough for the population, because all three, inflation, for a person who is earning a fixed income, inflation drives into their spending power. So at the same time, same with interest rates and taxation. So there is very little money left for people to spend. So consumption is low, and that's going to, depress the economy in the short term. And we're also faced with the limited ability to import. I mean, of our imports, because we still can only get 20 liters of petrol a week. So that has an effect. I mean, if you look at other products, there's a lot more. But as we know, only 20% of our imports are for consumption. So 80% is for intermediates and capital goods. This means that since we have a forex crisis and are able to only import in limited amounts, it's also affecting our export industries. and our manufacturing industries, which are also catering to our domestic markets. So it's a sort of a circle where it's a never-ending circle which keeps putting us in a depressed state. The other one is increasing poverty. So last year when the IMF was here, I was part of a team speaking to them. And I could say that even in a closed-door meeting, over half of the talk by the IMF was about poverty. So the IMF and political leaders here are very concerned with it, as we all must be aware that, according to some studies, half of Sri Lankans families or Sri Lankan families are finding it hard to even have 3 proper meals. I mean, that is a sort of a basic thing that should be given for a country which during the time of our independence was considered the second best economy in the world and called the Switzerland of Asia, or a country that was to become a Switzerland of Asia. So, and finally, due to all this, we're seeing a massive brain drain. So we have seen phases of brain drain, people moving out of the country in the past, but this is something that's much serious. So as part of a consulting project, when I was speaking to a large firm in Sri Lanka, what they were saying is that usually they get like 3,000 applications for management training programs. And this time the amount was, less than 150. So that shows the amount of not just people leaving, but just people are not even interested in applying for anything here because of the, as far as looking to move abroad. So this is a major challenge that's going to have very long-term effects in our economy. Especially also when considering that we have very low percentage of students into STEM graduates. So most of the people leaving the country are in this field. So this is a field that's going to be very needed, very much needed in the coming future. Like an example would be South Korea, when they wanted to expand and grow in the 1960s with reforms. The first thing they touched in education was STEM, because they knew that this was the kind of professionals that would be needed for companies to expand. So that is just a brief summary of what we're going to face here. And the next thing would be the global economic outlook. So here again, we're faced with high inflation. I mean, not as high as Sri Lanka, but to an extent high by Western standards or global standards. So that's having another effect because as a result of high inflation, a lot of central banks around the world are jacking up their interest rates, especially the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States. So that also means a stronger dollar, which in turn means that from fuel to many other goods are going to be priced at a much higher rate. So also we have high energy prices that's going to affect us soon, as hearing reports that oil prices could rise up. So due to the Russia-Ukraine war and sanctions against Russia. So that's going to have another impact, but there are also positives because many countries are moving towards a greener economy. Then we have high food prices, as we all know. So because due to a lot of wheat and other food products coming from Russia and Ukraine, and also fertilizer comes mainly from these two countries with a war going on between the two. So it's affecting the whole world, as we all know. Supply chain issues. We know that China is reopening, but for 3 years, China was under a lockdown, under the zero COVID policy. So there's a lot of disruptions, but not just due to their zero COVID policies, but also to the, you can call it a trade war between the US and China. So Western countries and Japanese companies are trying to decouple from China. So many businesses are trying to move away from the Chinese supply chains and towards the countries that are benefiting are mostly India and Vietnam. So that's another crisis going on in the globe. And so we're also looking at China reopening after zero COVID. So that's not a good time, especially when countries around the world are trying to tame inflation. So we are already hearing reports that oil refineries in China are buying up and piling up or stocking up on their crude oil. So this is going to drive up. And there are reports coming from OPEC that fuel can hit over $100 per barrel. So this is going to be another sort of a major hit for Sri Lanka with more inflation coming in. Hopefully, it doesn't go to such a high extent. And so economic growth is going to be reduced to 2.2% according to the OECD. So there are other estimates that are gloomier, but let's just look at this from 3.1% last year to 2.2% this year. So the thing to be noted, and why I say this, is because we need to understand the global economy. So because in a world of globalization, even though Sri Lanka is one of the most protected countries in the world due to import tariffs and policies of import substitution, we're still connected to the rest of the world. So whatever happens elsewhere affects us. And the other thing is also, due to the global economic crisis, many countries are reaching high debt stress levels. So according to a UN report, 54 countries are under debt stress. And with major economies such as Pakistan and Egypt nearing default, so it's going to be a sort of a crowding out effect when it comes to getting money from the IMF or from other bilateral partners. So, I mean, obviously, many of the major countries are going to prioritize giving aid to countries such as Pakistan, which is nuclear armed and, can go into anarchy, just like we sort of came to the edge in July. So that would be a more priority for other countries like Pakistan, Egypt, countries that are quite more significant for the rest of the major powers. So that's a sort of a troubling thing. So especially when we are in trouble and our friends are also not in the best of positions to help us. So let's look at how we got here. So the last 2 years have been sort of, there's been a lot of policy mishaps. So let's start with, so even before 2019, we were on an IMF program. So it was like tight, the country was sort of reaching stability, but then things changed a bit after the tax cuts. Maybe the intentions behind the tax cuts were good, or I don't know the actual intentions, but I assume that they're good, but the effects were quite devastating. So we already, as I mentioned before, we were having one of the lowest government revenue to GDP ratios in the world at 12%. But after the tax cuts, it came down to 8%. So this resulted in the global rating agencies, Fitch, Moody's, and S&P downgrading us and losing access to capital markets. So we were in a position where we were not able to access money from international capital markets. And to make things worse, we were affected by COVID, the lockdowns. So this affected our three main dollar earners or foreign exchange earners. The tourism industry was hard hit because there was a global lockdown as well. So it was severely affected and also resulted in an effect on remittances, because a major foreign earner for Sri Lanka is a lot of Sri Lankans working, especially in the Middle East and other countries, sending back money to their families. So this was another major hit due to the pandemic. And finally, also exports were affected severely. The garments industries and others due to the lockdown shutting down. And also there was a period when there was massive contraction, temporary contraction of global economy. So demand also dampened. So these were some of the effects in the last 2 years. And then we had the fertilizer ban, which where the government wanted to shift the entire country's agriculture sector within a very short time span away from chemical fertilizers towards organic fertilizers. So this also had an effect with agricultural output going down by 50%, and also severely affected the tea industry. And then we had the modern monetary theory policy of printing money. As many experts around the world say that Sri Lanka is being used as a textbook example of practically where MMT was used and it failed. So it's sad to know that many economists in the future are going to study Sri Lanka as an example to use against this policy. Then we had pegging the currency to 203 to the US dollar. And while the market rates for the dollar was much higher. So this resulted in most of even the remaining remittances being sent through informal channels, because the markets were offering a better rate. And also this made it many people who didn't know of informal channels started to know it, and it sort of got very difficult to get them back in using formal channels. So this was another loss on revenue. And the government decided to use up the reserves to keep the currency and at the same time to pay off our debts. So from $7.6 billion in reserves in 2019, we came down to just $50 million in April 2022. And not engaging the IMF was another major issue, a mistake, I would say, because we got signs of the country moving, or even reports saying the debt was unsustainable in as early as 2020. So that's almost 3 years ago. So if we had gone to the IMF or even defaulted back then, we would have defaulted with $7.6 billion in reserves. So, or I mean, even a lesser figure of $5 billion would have been like, we wouldn't have gone through all these crises. So during this time of debt restructuring or even a year to get out the IMF bailout, we would have had so much reserves to meet the demands of the people. So that was another mishap during that time. And as a result of all this, as we all know, Sri Lanka defaulted for the first time in its history. So then, now we are trying to get an IMF program, which requires two things primarily. I mean, there's a number of other things, but primarily one is to get back debt into a sustainable level. So that is primarily we need to restructure our debt. So here, as I'll go into this thing, so a chart, we know that there are three types of debt. One is multilaterals from the World Bank, the IMF, the ADB. So as a rule, general rule, out of respect, because they do lend to countries which are in trouble mostly, or developing countries, their debt is not restructured, though China is making a case that it should be restructured. But the general consensus globally is that multilateral debt is not restructured. And then we have the bilaterals. Of course, China is the largest lender, followed by Japan, India, and many other countries. So in the Paris Club, Japan is the largest lender. And then we have the international, the ISP holders, the private creditors. So this is how Sri Lanka's debt is at the moment. And it's quite complex. It's one of the most complex in the world because we've borrowed from various countries, like from Saudi Arabia to Iran to many others. So it's a very complicated process, but hopefully assurances have been given. And according to reports, we're just waiting on China to give the assurance to go ahead. So hopefully we can get that in the coming weeks, or even months. And then another major thing would be a primary budget surplus of 2.3%. As we know, we've had, currently we have a primary budget deficit of 4%. So 6.3% of fiscal consolidation in the next 2 years is going to be a very daunting task. So taxes naturally have to be increased. I don't necessarily agree with it, but somehow we have to bridge the fiscal deficit by 6.3%. So either it's going to be increasing government revenue through taxes and other measures, or it's going to be cutting down on many things. Probably a place to go to would be SOE restructuring and cutting down on other development expenditure. So then we also have the question of domestic debt restructuring, which is going to be devastating. But there's something interesting that the ISP holders have sent a letter to the IMF MD saying that domestic debt be reorganized. So they've used the word reorganized rather than restructured. And they have said that in accordance to keeping financial stability. So I'm not sure how that will play out, but that's going to be something interesting to watch out. And so let me get on to the structural causes for our economy. So most of the problems we have are not short-term, but decades in the making. So I wouldn't blame though a larger part of the blame could be for recent politicians or policies by the government. Larger portion also lies in structural causes, which are decades in the making. So to categorize one as populist policies, the first thing would be, so to start off, subsidies. I mean, Sri Lanka is famous for giving out subsidies, or as many would say, living beyond our means. So we've had a number of political parties coming into power, putting up populist policies or promises. So one would be like the famous rice from the moon, or then we had bread for 3.50 rupees and free fertilizer, 10,000 rupee increase of government servants, tax cuts. So these are something like, in my opinion, though politicians or political parties could be blamed, the people also willingly wanted this, though most of them did not have the proper knowledge. But there is always a thing like, if you have something for free, there's a time you have to pay for it. So I think for the decades of having cheaper bread or having cheaper rice, I think the time is right now where we are all having to pay for this. And then we have the public sector expansion. So during, gradually Sri Lanka has seen an expansion of the public sector. So it was up until early 2000s, it was at around 700,000. But by mid 2010s, by around 2015, it had come up to 1.4 million. So almost a doubling. So this has resulted in pensions, salaries increasing. And in 2021, the salaries and pensions of state employees had reached 86% of government revenue, which is unsustainable. So this is something that has to be looked into, because then you have had another 70% of government revenue going to paying interest. So already you're looking at a 56% deficit, and then there is no money for development like education or health or some of the. So there, as a result, we are borrowing, which I'll come on to later. So this is something that has to be fixed. And also, I'm not saying that should be downsized, but also many government employees in institutions need to be paid higher for the services they offer. And also places where they are not needed, they could be restructured. So that is something that's very delicate and has to be handled in a very careful way. So then the other thing is low taxation. As we know, we have one of the lowest government revenue to GDP in the world at around 8%. So that's extremely low. When you look at Scandinavian countries, it's around 40%. And the taxes, the other issue about taxes is that direct taxes account for only 25% of what we are earning. Indirect taxes make up the rest, which means that the problem is, as explained earlier by myself and others, would be like, for example, you take somebody from a rural area who works in a farm and who can barely earn enough to meet his or her needs. And they usually eat the same amount of rice or other commodities as probably some of the richest people in Sri Lanka. So they're paying almost the same indirect taxes such as VAT or others. So it's a bit unfair that the poor are actually making equal contributions to government revenue, but at the same time, the subsidies, like for example, if you take the fuel subsidies, a Land Cruiser in Colombo is pumping up so much of petrol or diesel, which is subsidized. Then the person at the rural area who is also contributing indirectly to government revenue has probably never seen a vehicle like this. So also the other thing about subsidies is that, for example, if you want to benefit from petrol subsidies or diesel or any other subsidies that are given, the thing is, you have to, the more you consume, the more you're making use of the subsidies. So obviously, who uses petrol and diesel most? Obviously, the wealthiest segments in society. So this is why myself and many others like Dr. Shanta Devarajan, who was a former chief economist to the World Bank, advocate a policy of giving cash to the people. I mean, we can use an Aadhaar system like in India, where everybody's bank accounts, everything is connected to their NIC numbers, where we can make a sort of a cash transfer instead of subsidies, which do not necessarily go to the people they are intended to. Then we'll come on to the fiscal policies. So here we've naturally had very large deficits over decades. So even a primary budget surplus has only been achieved very few times. You could even say 4 times. Then the problem is that sort of lack of discipline. And there's reasons for that, or how it's been financed is, one thing is monetary financing. That is mostly borrowing from the central bank. So here again, you cannot achieve financial discipline when you know that, money could be printed and pumped into the treasury to handle losses. So that's something that's basic to handle financial discipline at the treasury. The second thing is obviously debt financing. So borrowing, the government has been borrowing externally and domestically. So domestically, mostly from the state banks, People's Bank, BOC, prime lenders. So here the effect is also again a major effect on the private sector, because there is a crowding out effect when the government keeps borrowing so much from these banks. And also because the government is taking up so much, there is very little left for the private sector, which means that borrowing costs are much higher for them as well. And also one thing about large deficits is that since we print money to bridge the gap, Sri Lanka consistently has had higher inflation rates when compared to countries in the rest of the region. So that's also a major reason why we need to sort of balance our books. So other reasons are inconsistent policies. So here again, we don't have permanent secretaries to ministries. So ministers change, which is natural as the will of the people, but secretaries also change, policies change. And recently I was at an IPS, Institute of Policy Studies lecture, where they were showing that even ministries are, randomly realigned with each. Like the youth ministry would be with something else for 2 years, and then they would be again partnered with another ministry. So there is a lack of consistency and sort of chaos there. So this is one area, and also taxes, being changed every few years. So no business can actually plan the outlook properly with this sort of economic environment. The other thing is protectionist policies, which will come on to later, which we've noticed that starting from the mid-2000s, we've sort of shifted back to protectionist policies. So as the country expanded or liberalized in 1977 under President J.R. Jayawardena, we found that we heavily shifted towards the liberal economy, away from protectionism. But what we found was even in 1994 to 2005 under President Chandrika Bandaranaike, she sort of continued that trend towards liberalization. So privatization was happened. I mean, SLT was privatized under President Kumar Tunga, and trade was further liberalized. But after the mid-2000s, I think the whole thinking changed more towards protectionist policies. And what we found was exports to GDP reduced from around 40% to 20%. So that meant that we couldn't get the foreign currency we needed to pay back our debt, which was rising at a heavy state. So then lack of FTAs, which I will come on to later, and sort of also sentiments against investment. So recently I was speaking to a very famous economist in Sri Lanka, and he was saying that if it was a country such as, for example, Adani was visiting Sri Lanka recently, and he was saying if it was any other country like Vietnam or Indonesia, he would have been rolled a red carpet. But in Sri Lanka, he was met with protests. So there is always a general tendency to look at investments in a sort of a negative way by certain segments. So this shouldn't be the case, because for us to develop, we need to have financial capital coming in from the rest of the world. Lack of entrepreneurs, that's another key area which we need to focus on. And I'll touch on this later. And government red tape, that's with a large bureaucracy. Just to get simple approvals, you need to go to very different departments, 5 or 6, at least in my experience. So these are things that need to be affect ease of doing business. Then we have labor and land laws, one of the highest retrenchment costs in the world when it comes to labor and land laws. I mean, government owning around 82% of land in Sri Lanka. Then, so this is just salaries and pensions of government servants, as you can see from 2014 to 2021. And we see a thing where the expenditure keeps rising while tax or government revenue keeps coming down. And the gray line is a percentage. So we've reached around 86% there. Then we come on to challenges faced by businesses. So I'll just briefly talk on how businesses are being affected at the same time. So high interest rates, as I explained at the beginning, are affecting businesses. Borrowing costs are high. It's very difficult to get a new loan. As you know, it's very difficult to make an annual return of nearly 30%. Higher taxation is biting into not just businesses with corporate taxes, but also consumption is going down. High inflation means things are quite unpredictable. Raw material prices going up. Then salary increases will be coming in as workers shift to other locations due to inflation. Then we also have the challenge of access to finance. This is something that Sri Lankan businesses face because what we find is that a number of bank loans go by asset-based rather than cash flow-based. So here again, we need to look into where bookkeeping can be encouraged, because you cannot really blame the banks as well, because most of the businesses we find do not have proper financial records. Low adoption of technology, as Professor Watawala was saying at the beginning, the World Economic Forum is focusing a lot on technology as well. So here again, what we find is that businesses have to look into technology, not just to compete against other countries, developed countries, and their businesses who are heavily shifting into AI and other means, but also locally. I mean, large businesses in Sri Lanka have the means, the capital, and the human capital, the financial capabilities to adopt technology. So SMEs need to also get on this to make production more efficient. Lack of soft skills. I'm a member of the Moratuwa University's Enterprise Operations Committee. So there I find that even the graduates, they are the best talent we can see. I would even say not just Sri Lanka, but in the world. Very high technical skills, but sometimes in many cases, we see a lack of soft skills, which are very much essential. And as the World Economic Forum and others predict, with the advent of AI, most of repetitive skills will be automized, but soft skills such as communication, creative thinking, critical thinking, creativity, I mean, these are things that cannot be replaced easily by machines. So we need to focus more on soft skills as well, and that is a challenge for businesses. Bureaucracy, as I mentioned before, dealing with different departments, getting approvals, and finally, import controls. So these are some of the, briefly touching some of the challenges faced by businesses in Sri Lanka. So what are some of the opportunities? So here again, we find that Sri Lanka has immense potential, especially when it comes to the opportunities we have as a country. So here, the first thing and the most important thing is strategic location. So if anybody is following global news, they would know that while the rest of the world, especially the major economic blocs such as the US, the EU, and China are struggling with growth, we see our immediate neighbor with whom we have a free trade agreement, which is India, which is expected to grow at 7% this year. And according to some a think tank, a global think tank, their GDP is going to set to be 10 trillion by 2035. So from around 3 trillion to 10 trillion, almost a tripling of their economic size in the next 12 years. So this is going to be an immense opportunity for Sri Lanka. We have a free trade agreement. We are very close to India. And if we can capitalize on it, I mean, we have around 1.4 billion people living right next to us and a 10 trillion economy, which is growing very fast, or I mean, a 10 trillion economy by 2035. So this is a great opportunity for us to capitalize on. And also our strategic location also means that when you look at countries in South Asia, according to the World Bank, we have one of the lowest regional trade in the world. I mean, even sub-Sahara areas, it comes to around 22%, where countries trade with immediate neighbors. But in South Asia, it's around 5%, which is very poor and somewhere Sri Lanka can capitalize on. And we also have a free trade agreement with Pakistan. So a sort of a middle country between India, probably China, if hopefully if we can get an FTA. So Sri Lanka can be a sort of a middle country for trade between India, China, Pakistan, and many other countries in the future, if we can strategize our location and capabilities well. The other opportunity is human capital. As we know, I don't have to say this, but we have excellent human capital. The Sri Lankans going abroad and performing with various organizations, the awards they get is telling that how much the value of our human capital here. And also even large global organizations outsource their many of their functions in Sri Lanka, knowing our capabilities here. So this is something that we can really capitalize on. But sadly, because of the brain drain, we're losing a number of people outdoor. Hopefully, this can be reversed. Resilience, we're known as a nation that's very resilient. We've gone through many crises from a 26-year war to the pandemic, a tsunami, and many other crises. But we are always a nation that rises up to the challenge once again. Renewable energy, I'll speak on this later. I've written a piece for the IMF on this as well. So there's a lot of potential for Sri Lanka when it comes to renewable energy, especially hydro power. Then we have solar energy and also offshore wind power. As the World Bank reports, we're even able to produce more offshore wind power than what is needed in Sri Lanka. So giving an opportunity for exporting. Then when it comes to tourism, as Lonely Planet magazine termed us the #1 tourist destination in the world. So this is something we need to capitalize on, get the right things going. I see that currently we need to get out the message that the country is much safer to come into. And of course, need to work on the marketing bit more, because Singapore, though it's a much smaller country, has many times more tourists coming in. So we need to study where we are wrong and what we can do to bridge the gap. Then I'll also briefly touch on what should businesses do. I've been working in entrepreneurship development also with the World Economic Forum and sometimes with the Asian Development Bank in most of their startup ecosystem building areas. So one thing I find is, if you ask me, the number one reason why startups or even businesses fail is a lack of market research. So 40% of startups fail because they don't have basic understanding of what the market needs. They spend 3 to 4 years developing a product, go to the market and find out that nobody actually needs their product, or they're not even aware that somebody else has already made a different product. So market research, I would always advise businesses, just spend a little bit of time understanding what the market needs. All you have to do is speak to a few people at least to understand whether the product works or not. Technology adoption, that's something that's very much needed. To make everything more efficient, especially when we are moving into a culture where a lot of jobs are being lost due to companies adopting things where they become more efficient. So the use of AI and other mechanisms should be used, especially the focus on cloud computing. Those are areas that we need to really work on. Outsourcing, as a management consultant, one of the advice I usually, or the team usually gives, is in areas to outsource production. Like, for example, if you are a medium scale company, I mean, it's not ideal or makes sense to have a digital marketing team there. Because, you know, you can easily, because there's overheads, then I don't know how efficient that would be. But usually, just giving an example, you could outsource it because there are many companies that do this on a large scale, like digital marketing firms. I'm just using digital marketing as an example. So there they have hundreds of employees. They've worked with dozens of different companies. So they have the economies of scale and the economies of knowledge. So outsourcing would be an ideal thing during this economic climate. The other advice would be organizational transformation. We're looking at an age where creativity is very important. One thing I always state is that according to a study in 1914, the corporate lifespan of an S&P 500 company, so these are the 500 largest companies in the world, was 90 years, so almost a century. Now, when you look at it, it's just 10 years. The average is just 10 years. So companies are rapidly coming up. There's disruptive innovation and companies simply get wiped out. Companies such as Kodak and others are examples. Companies, or even Nokia would be another example. So there is a lot of disruptive innovation, and if you're not in the lookout, you can collapse. So the reason I associate this with organizational transformation is because we need flatter structures. What we find in Sri Lanka is a lot of bureaucracy. So a person joining as a junior has little access to the CEO to give their ideas. So you need to have a flatter structure. This is something that's used by Google. For example, in their X Lab, anybody working there, employee, can directly give an idea to one of the co-founders, Sergey Brin. So this means that the ideas are brought in. Another example is Amazon. Like any employee, if he can get a couple of other employees to sign on his idea, can put a company-wide press release, which will be read by the CEO of Amazon, probably Jeff Bezos or his whoever succeeded him. So these are things that we need to work on. Communicate better to the workforce. This is something that I emphasize a lot on for companies, because recently in one of the projects I was working with a Fortune 500 company. So here, what we wanted to do was, before developing a strategy, the thing was to ask the directors there. So this was a large organization, most of their directors, I think there were 7 directors, they're all like the cream of the crop. So most of them have degrees from Harvard or Stanford, and they've worked as CEOs in many of the largest companies in the world. But when you put 7 of them and individually ask each of them what is the strategy of the company, and to everybody's surprise, like all of them gave very different answers. So it was like, even at the board level, there was a lack of understanding on what the strategy is. So generally companies kind of assume that the people, employees at each level would get to know. Like why I say this is because we generally say the company has to grow by 20% over the next 3 years. But what does this mean for somebody who's working in the legal department or the marketing department? You have to break it down, communicate to them, and give them each individual tasks and goals. The last thing is think like a consultant. So I don't want to promote myself, but the reason I say this is because as a consultant, we work in very different fields. So when I initially joined, I was in sustainability, then human capital, now more into economics. So it's like you get to know better of the organization. So one advice is that for employees to work in different departments, even if it's for a few weeks, so they can better understand what's going on in the rest of the company. So to have a more holistic approach things. So finally, I'll come on to some of the recommendations for economic growth for Sri Lanka, or at this stage, an economic recovery would be a better term. So the first thing would be, and the most important thing would be the independence of the central bank. So as I mentioned before, one of the primary reasons why we are in a crisis is because of lack of fiscal discipline. So a primary reason is because the central bank is always there to help out if the treasury runs short of money. So this thing should be curtailed. And also the second thing, just to give an example, we have the country of Germany. So Germany, before joining the euro, they had one of the most stable economies in the world. Even during 1970s, when the US and everybody else was experiencing inflation, Germany was a bit steady. So the reason was, what we find is that the role of the German central bank is primarily price stability, controlling inflation and nothing else. So even if you look at the US central bank, the Federal Reserve, the goal is maybe controlling inflation, but they also have stimulating economic growth. So, adjusting interest rates to control growth, and at times to keep it down. So here we need to focus on this, because if there is a independent central bank, then the treasury will know that everything has to be balanced there, and there is no free check. So this is a primary thing that has to be attained, because an example is not just Sri Lanka, but even abroad we find examples of countries suffering due to a lack of independence of the central bank. Like a very famous example would be in 1971 in the US, where President Nixon, the US President Nixon, he pressurized the Federal Reserve Bank chairman to keep interest rates down. So the chairman, because Nixon was facing a re-election the next year, so the Fed kept the rates down, and as a result, the US experienced a decade of inflation, which also spread to the rest of the world. So here again, the emphasis, the number one thing we need to do is an independent central bank. So it's positive that the government is looking into this. And recently I saw that a cabinet approval has been granted in this direction. The second thing is ease of doing business. So this is extremely important, because we rank 99th in the world when it comes to ease of doing business. So here again, a range of different things, like for example, not many people speak about this, but not just registering a company, which takes around 2 weeks, at least according to paper, but while in New Zealand it takes half a day, and in New Zealand everything can be seen in one web page of how to open a business. But also what many people don't talk about in Sri Lanka is closing down company. It takes almost a year to do this. There are many businessmen who have spoken to me and said this is the primary reason why they don't register a company in the first place, or are quite reluctant to do this. So this also means that not many companies are coming into the formal structure and registering a limited liability company, because if things don't work out, a partner pulls out at the last stage when forming company, it means that the person, whoever registered, has to spend almost a year winding things down. And the other more important thing that we need to focus on is also when it comes to ease of doing business. According to the World Bank, when it comes to enforcing a business law, we rank 162nd in the world. So this is extremely poor. It means that according to the World Bank, even a court in Colombo takes around 4 years to resolve a basic business dispute. So this is a major hindrance when it comes to businesses wanting to operate here. So with this sort of things, it's not just foreigners wanting to invest here, but even locals would think twice before doing business here. So these are areas that we need to work on. The third thing would be innovation. So I recently wrote a piece for the IMF, which was awarded as the 7th most popular IMF article for 2022 on the effects of innovation on economic growth. What we find is that, like, for example, one area that I always suggest is that a combination of universities and the private sector. So if you look at innovation, Switzerland ranks #1 in the world consistently, I think for the last about 9 times in the last dozen years as the most innovative country in the world. And one thing that we find they do is they sort of have a partnership between the government, the private sector, and universities. And why this works is that, let me explain. Like, for example, in Switzerland, if company A wants to do research and development, instead of doing it in-house, they usually outsource it to the university. So what this does is that the university, the lecturers, or the people working there have an understanding of what's going on in the industry. What are the problems? So they are like evolving to meet the problems and the needs of society or the corporate sector. And that also means that students are also getting experience dealing with problems in the corporate sector. So they are better qualified when they leave with experience. And but the more important thing is that once the university solves the R&D problem or does it for company A, when company B comes, the university now has more experience, having already dealt with company A. So it's able to give a better solution to company B. So company C, a much better solution. So this is why I emphasize that even in Sri Lanka, we need better partnerships with universities, the private sector, and the government. So that's on innovation. And the other thing is export-oriented economy. So we need to be more integrated into the global supply chains, which I'll talk on in the next point. So we are a country that has shifted towards import substitution. So here again, we need to focus more on FTAs and tapping into global supply chains. So recently with Deloitte, I was talking to a colleague of mine who is from Chile, the South American country. So they have really transformed from a sort of a poor country, which was very close to the rest of the world, to becoming a country which has very good economic growth. And she told me that the primary reason was trade. So Chile has one of the highest, if not the highest number of FTAs in the world. And they are part of like these large trade, global trade organizations and agreements as well. So here again, the benefit is that in Chile, though they have FTAs, they also have a flat out tariff rate of 6% for all products. Of course, there are a few exceptions. So that helps them and their industries grow. So of course, with FTAs, what we find in Chile was that some industries were wiped out. Like, for example, certain apparel manufacturing did go out of business because cheaper things came from China. But it also saw certain industries coming up. Like, for example, the wine industry, which was incapable of catering because Chile is a small country with around 19 million people. Now that it's open to the rest of the world, it can scale up at a much larger level, knowing that the rest of the world is its market. So these are some of the advantages of FTA. Sorry. And coming on to the global supply chains, the trends have changed towards the days are gone when a country could produce something and export it on its own. Now the fashion is more about tapping into global supply chains. Like, for example, let me give you the example. The best example would be China. So China, as we all know, is a global manufacturing superpower. No country in the world, even the United States, cannot compete with China when it comes to manufacturing. Sorry. So here, what we find interesting is that an iPhone produced in China, only 7% of the value addition is done in China. And even a manufacturing superpower such as China needs components from 43 different countries to manufacture an iPhone. So even China cannot do this. So expecting a country such as Sri Lanka would be, but countries that are benefiting from tapping into global supply chains are Vietnam, India, and a good example of a businessman in Sri Lanka who has successfully done this is Rohan Pallavatta. So he has tapped into a key need in the automobile industry in their global supply chains and found a niche in it and is producing to cater to it. Sorry. The next thing would be improved taxation. So here again, sorry, I'm losing a bit of my voice. So improved taxation is very much needed because, as I mentioned, we have one of the lowest government revenue to GDP ratios in the world. So it was 12% in 2019. Now it's come down to 8%. So what we find is that we need to improve taxation, not just increasing the rates, as I mentioned, 75% comes from indirect taxes. So we need to focus more on direct taxes as well. It has to be fairer because the number of tax files is very low. So a very tiny portion of Sri Lanka's population actually pay income tax. So we need to widen this. There are many very wealthy people who do professions, who deal in cash, are not accountable or are not taxed as they should be. So this is something that the government really needs to work on. And one example, as I study, is, for example, when you look at Georgia, they have a very simple thing. It's just a flat out rate of, I think, 15% income tax and 20%, I think, corporate tax. I'm not sure of the figures, but that would be very much better, giving a flat out rate and then leaving out the exceptions. Because when you go into exceptions, only things get complicated. Though I'm not a tax expert, that's something that I think would be a better solution to solve this. Then the other issue is restructuring SOEs. So here we are looking at a massive problem. As I mentioned, many state-owned enterprises are losing. So here again, we see an argument where we say that, you know, loss-making SOEs should be restructured or they should be privatized. But the question really is, like, even if it's profit-making, the question is, as a regulator and a legislator, so why should a government be in charge of running any business, to be honest? I mean, that's not the role of the government. Of course, we need the government for running essential services. I mean, healthcare would be a sector and many others. But at the same time, what I'm talking about is there a need for the government to be handling SOEs which are related in the hotel industry or for example, retail or any others? So here the question is like, what is the objective? Why should the government be involved in this? So this is obviously the government, as we all know, is not capable of doing this because it's the role of the private sector. So here again, as expected, SOEs, many of them run into losses. And it's also been a sort of a base for many political appointments to boards and others of these SOEs. So here again, we need to restructure them. That would be a primary thing to going forward if it means for economic recovery in Sri Lanka. And also the losses made by SOEs is around 100 billion rupees a month. So if we can cut this off completely, we can basically double spending on healthcare and education. So imagine how much we can do with the educational budget being doubled, if possible, in the next few years. So the eighth thing would be a greener economy. So as I mentioned, I've written a piece for the IMF on this, and also recently co-wrote a piece for the World Economic Forum with Eric Solheim, who was the former executive director of United Nations Environment Program. So here again, we look at some of the areas how a green economy can help. As I mentioned before, we are very good with hydro because we have some of the, when it comes to a certain area, the largest number of rivers for a country, one of the largest in the world. So tap into hydropower, solar energy, and as I mentioned, the World Bank says offshore wind power. We have the capabilities of, with proper investment, to have more energy coming from wind power, which can meet more than our domestic needs. So there is an opportunity to export as well. With the electricity grid connecting South India to Sri Lanka, I see this as a major opportunity to export energy to India. And also another area that we can concentrate on green economy is hydrogen. So we see the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, is focusing on gaining 25% of the hydrogen market in the next decade. And they are only focusing on blue hydrogen and green hydrogen. So here again, with wind power, Sri Lanka has an opportunity to focus entirely on green hydrogen, which is the most expensive, to export to, not just, if it's in hydrogen form, we can export to many other countries like the ASEAN countries or even to Western countries. So here we have immense potential to move into. And also the other thing is a greener economy is anyway essential, because what we find is that the EU taxonomy laws and US Security Exchange Commission laws. So it's going to become increasingly difficult for companies that do not manufacture in a greener way to tap into Western markets or even Japanese markets in the coming years. So a greener, broader national policy driving our economy towards a greener future would also help our businesses be able to tap into global markets. So the ninth thing is focusing on entrepreneurship development. Here again, we have one of the lowest number of entrepreneurs for a population in the world. So formally it comes to 1%, informally 3%. Bangladesh has 12% of its population in entrepreneurship, Thailand, Vietnam, over 20%. So here again, if we are going to recover economically, we need to grow the private sector. So there are two ways for the private sector to grow. One is for existing companies to expand. The other is to get new people in. So an entrepreneur created is somebody who can create not just somebody, an entrepreneur created is not just less of a job seeker, but this entrepreneur can also produce, create jobs for 5 others. So each time we produce an entrepreneur, we are just reducing the number of people without jobs. So that is a primary area where we need to focus on. So ease of doing this would be an area where we need to really focus on to spur entrepreneurship. And we also need a general ecosystem development. So major firms have to come forward and at the same time also support from the government and many others. So this is something that I was part of doing at Moratuwa University under the World Bank Head Project, where we were trying to create an entrepreneurship ecosystem around the university. So then we come on to labor and land laws. As I mentioned, we have one of the highest retrenchment costs in the world. And also when it comes to land, the government owns 82% of the land in Sri Lanka, which leaves very little for anyone else. And some of the government land is leased out to people. So here there are 2 disadvantages. One is that the person who is leasing out or person who doesn't have land cannot use that land as collateral to invest or to develop the land. And the other thing is, if the land is not his or hers, they're not willing to do long-term investments in that land. So a very a recommendation would be to give away land to people who can use it and encourage more private ownership of large areas of unused government land rather than leasing it out. Giving the land away would be a much better option, because then they can at least use it as collateral to gain loans and develop the land. And also they will be encouraged more to invest in long-term building in that the land they have been given. The one before the last thing, the 11th thing would be gender empowerment. So here again, only 37% of women in Sri Lanka work. So according to a study, we find that if the gender balance can be balanced, the $28 trillion can be added to the global economy. That's almost twice of China's GDP. So if the gender gap can be removed in Sri Lanka, we can add another $20 billion to our GDP. So this is something we need to work on, and not just on the workforce, but also on entrepreneurship. So I have written a piece for the World Bank on this, on female entrepreneurship. And what we find is that a very interesting stat is that when it comes to larger businesses, like for example, the largest businesses in Sri Lanka, only 5% are owned by women. But when it comes to the micro level, large amounts of the number of businesses owned by women are much higher. So here again, what we need to do is help them scale up and also encourage women to look into areas where there is potentially high growth. Like for example, there is a lack of female entrepreneurship, not just in Sri Lanka, but even in Silicon Valley when it comes to the tech space. So that is one area that's expanding heavily. As we all know now, if you look at some of the companies with the largest market capitalization, it's Google, Amazon, Microsoft. These are all tech companies. In the 90s, it was just banks and oil companies, but now everything's been taken over by tech companies. So that's where the growth is. So we need to encourage more female participation in tech-related industry as well. And finally, before I finish off, I want to speak on consistent policies. As I said before, there are no more permanent secretaries. So ministers changing is understandable, but secretaries change, policies change. So the tax structure, tariffs. So when there is a lot of inconsistency, so it's very difficult for any business to operate. So any business, like when we see most of the, for example, when you look at businesses in Sri Lanka that are doing outsourced business, what we find is that they have long-term contracts, sometimes 5 years, 10 years, So when suddenly the tax is increased or there is inflation or other tariff rates are brought up or brought down, it's very difficult to plan over 10 years. So most of the time companies take on the losses by themselves. So if we can improve all this, I believe that, and I'm very confident that Sri Lanka can improve. And finally, before I finish off, I want to state that Sri Lanka, as I've mentioned before, we are at a crossroad. So right now, we can either take the road of Argentina, where we don't reform and repeatedly go to the IMF again and again, or we can be like India under Dr. Manmohan Singh, where he did the reforms and India has not been to the IMF for another 30 years. So it's a crisis, but out of crisis comes opportunities as well. And it's time for us to capitalize on it. Thank you very much. Happy to take any questions. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Talal Rafi. I think we are very happy because you covered the entire, maybe the whole structure from beginning to end. So all our participants definitely would have got a real meaning of the whole thing. So I think there are a few questions, but I just want to make two comments. One is that you said you should think like a consultant. In fact, this was a matter that came up at we had a tax forum recently, and where they said that if you not only think, but if you work like a consultant, or you work as a consultant, then your taxation could be less than a person who is employed. So I think that's another very good thing. But and the last one that you mentioned about permanent secretaries. Now that is something that we need to really bring in if we are going to have a change, and also the permanent secretaries would be responsible for carrying out these functions. So these are two comments. I think the time is very short, but I will now invite Ruchira Perera and Tiral Roche, if you can kindly take one by one the questions and put it fast so that we can finish it. Ruchira, you can start first. Tiral, how about you then?
Thank you, very informative presentation. I think out of the questions, I think mainly what are the participants are asking is, what is the role of a multilateral organization like IMF, World Bank, that they can do in this kind of situation? Can they force the country? Can they advise? What kind of action can they do? Now, you said a lot of things that we can do. What are their role in this?
So, thank you for the question. So I believe that, especially I assume that you're asking about the whole process about going forward. So there is the thing is, like, it's a bit complicated because according to other bilaterals, it's China, they are not getting the adequate financial assurances from China. So this is also makes it a bit complicated because even if the IMF wants to go ahead, it cannot, because you need to have debt sustainability. Otherwise, whatever loans that are coming from the IMF, or as we all know, the IMF, people say that it's just $2.9 billion. But what people have to realize is that the ADB and the World Bank are waiting for assurance from the IMF. So once that is done, according to Dr. Devarajan in our last panel, he said there is at least $5 billion waiting to come from the World Bank and the ADB. So this is all dependent on the IMF. So the IMF plays a role like how the big four do. Like, it's more like assurance. So many of them would open up to us after knowing that the IMF is. So if a company is audited by Deloitte or KPMG, then there is more this thing for investors or anybody, even banks, to lend. So that is the primary role of the IMF. But at this time, I would say that it's a bit complicated. So the negotiations have to be mostly handled with the foreign ministry. As the president said, it's good to know that he has met all the demands of the IMF, though we are not clear what exactly the 15 are, but he has met them. But it's really, without the external debt sustainability, it'll be a bit difficult to go forward. Because what I hear from other nations, from other diplomats, is that, if they do go ahead, one thing is that it's not like other countries, like other African countries, the exposure to Euro bonds is much higher than China. But here, of about over half of the bilateral comes from China. So it's even difficult, even if they wanted to go, I don't know how practical it would be to go ahead. So we'll have to wait on that. And there is a positive, let's say that they said a 2-year moratorium given, and they're willing to discuss. So let's wait for the best.
Thank you. Ruchiri, over to you.
Thank you, Professor. Doctor, there's a question, and I don't know whether you have answered this question in any part of your presentation. Some people are asking, now people believe when IMF money comes to the country, the exchange rate will come down to, let's say, about 270, 280. Will it actually happen, or will it remain at the current level? Is it pegged at the moment?
Thank you for the question. So I don't know, I'm not really there formally. It's kind of like in the middle, pegged, and at the same time, I would say a bit floating as well. So it's a bit difficult to understand. But with the IMF thing coming in, as I mentioned, there's a lot of aid waiting to come in. So obviously, it's going to be good for the currency, the exchange rate. So we can expect it to come down, but I'm not really sure at what level it will stay. So that is something. This is a question that even I asked to Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy, and he said the same thing. So we have to wait for how the markets adjust to get to the point there.
Doctor, there's another question.
Sure.
I heard somewhere the cabinet has approved today that we have decided today that we should start repaying the debt. So when do you think that we should start doing this? What is the right time?
Sorry, you mean the external or the
foreign debt? Foreign debt.
Foreign. I think no. I think what the cabinet is referring to is the multilateral debt. So that is something that is not. That's not something that we can restructure. Like we have to pay back the World Bank, the ADB, and others. So that is something that's entirely out of our default. So even though we have defaulted, we have only defaulted on bilateral and the private creditors' debt. So we still have to pay the multilaterals. But it's the thing that multilaterals usually refinance. So if you're paying a debt, usually we will get something else from the World Bank. So it's something that's this thing. So what they're referring to is the multilateral debt. Yes.
Multilateral debt.
Yes.
Tiral, anything that you have there?
Yeah, I think, Ruchira, go ahead, no problem.
Yeah, Professor, there's a question on corruption. I think one participant is asking the role of corruption to this crisis, and how can we overcome this corruption in order to address these economic issues. I would like to get your opinion on that, Doctor.
Sure. The one thing would be, I think the IMF, for example, in addressing corruption, they have stated that we need more transparency on the fiscal side. So making things known, like for example, in countries such as the UK, whatever the government spends, people can find out. So that kind of makes it better. So I'm not an expert on addressing corruption, but in my view, I find that we need to have better transparency and also auditing. Like many of SOEs are not audited. So nobody really can find information or even know how much goes in, how much comes out. So these are areas that we need to work on.
Okay, thank you, Doctor.
Actually, on the corruption area,
Yes.
there was a study that was done by Transparency International, and what they said is countries that had more professional accountants employed, the corruption rate was low. So I think this would be a good indicator for the government to use more professional accountants and recruit them so that they will be able to reduce the rate of corruption.
Yes, sure.
Tiral, anything?
Professor, there is one more question on IMF. Doctor, if we have time, you can answer this question as well. The participant is asking, okay, whether the IMF proposal, especially the tax revenue increases, their demand that the tax revenue to be increased within a short period of time, how justifiable it is?
So basically, there's something that has to be stated is that, so basically the IMF wants a fiscal consolidation discipline, which is good. Like even if you take a family, like if somebody is earning 100,000, you can't keep spending 180,000. So there's going to be either you have to increase your income to 180 or reduce it. So what the IMF has usually even earlier has said is revenue-based fiscal consolidation is because our spending is 15%, which is like normally on average countries expenditure should be 20%. So we are just still the government expenditure is lower compared to an average. But if you see the government revenue, it's extremely low. So I don't agree with the way the thing is structured. Maybe the tax slabs are low, but taxation is something that's extremely important, because one thing is that, yeah, justifiable, that's a different question. I feel like the rate should be a bit higher. So because people are already going through that, I don't know how people can pay it. But at the same time, it's also something that has to be done at the same time. Because if you're not going to get revenue from here, it's just the other option would be, since we are already unable to borrow, it's going to be printing of money. And that is inflationary tax. So that's anyway going to take away our income. So it's a bit difficult to justify, but I believe the government also has no choice at the moment.
Right. Mr. Karunaratne, do you like to say something? Mr. Karunaratne from the central bank.
Yeah, probably I will ask a question from Talal. Of course, Talal, let me thank you for the wonderful presentations. And my question is, now you mentioned about one of the key, elements that moving forward in terms of growth is the export growth. So where now, if you look at the numbers, we are highly concentrated to the US and Europe market. So, and those are the two markets, and again, highly depend on GSP plus concessions.
Right.
So, which again is highly vulnerable, during the past also, which was subject to certain conditionalities. When the government is not in a position to fulfill those conditionalities, those will be taken away. So what would be the right strategy? Because if we cannot adopt a competitive market strategy and highly depend on those concessions, ultimately which will be a significant adverse impact when we are unable to fulfill conditions. So what is your suggestion to overcome, given the high concentration to those markets?
Right. So that is something that, as far as I'm concerned, I think that our industries have become quite dependent on it. So we also need to sort of, one option is, as I mentioned, we are heavily concentrated on those areas. But what other economists who I speak to, especially at the Deloitte Economist Network and all, they suggest is that there are other markets emerging as well, which we can tap into. Like, for example, in my talk, I was saying how in the next 12 years, the Indian economy is going to triple, so to $10 trillion. And there are open economies. So there may be areas where we can tap into. So that's one area. And the other thing is, like, I feel that as far as concessions go, right now, if there is a danger of leaving it, we should already start thinking that of how we can produce, already assuming that we have already lost it. So that might be a better way, and also to up our value addition. So here again, moving into industries that like for example, when we look at the economy of Thailand, what we find is that early on they were, or even South Korea, they were the same as us, garments. So apparels was their main thing, but then they moved into electronic items and others. So here again, my main thing is we need to have more FTAs, free trade agreements, and tap into global supply chains. So FTAs means not just for our companies, but also encourages multinational companies to set up here so that they can produce their goods back out. So this will also, kind of have a political bearing in their countries, especially if US and large organizations are able to set up businesses here. So their lobbying power in the US and EU governments are much stronger than a Sri Lankan president or prime minister trying to lobby support there. So these can be alternatives.
Thank you, Talal. I think time is also running out. So let me thank you. But I just wanted to make one comment, what you said, that is about the strategic location. I think this is one of prime importance. And in fact, I have really seen that although we are now in this difficult situation, that it is giving dividends. Now, one is Sri Lankan Airlines. They are really will be able to be a hub for the airline industry. You see, at the moment, they are really doing and have a close link with India and maybe the other countries where they are acting. So if we now actually this government must now look at these areas and develop it so that will help us to come. Then again, the same thing in the port, if we are able to develop this, then again, we are going to be a hub, because of course we have been talking of a financial hub, but I think there are very many areas where the hub concept, where Sri Lanka can be a real success. So I think your lecture, the lecture today was really fabulous. I think it's extremely good because you covered all areas, especially I think, especially for our management accountants and the others from the corporate sector, where they got a feel of all the areas, which really gave a very good insight into what is happening. But what we really need is today people who can make things happen. There are so many webinars, seminars, so many things, but we hardly find any people trying to work on those and make them a success. That's why I really spoke of Sri Lankan, because at the moment they are carrying out that work, where these people are coming in. Of course, they may be having various other problems, but that's the area where, and I'm sure that if they're looking at privatization, this would be one of the best things that they can use for the privatization, and any global investor would come. So I think so there are very good areas. I'm sure your consultancy work definitely, and also with a leading firm like Deloitte has greatly helped. So with those comments, I would love to invite Mr. Tiril Roche to give the vote of thanks to Mr. Talal Rafi.
Yeah, Talal, thank you very much. Fantastic presentation. I think you were well researched. The topic that was discussed with very clear examples, nice suggestions, proposals, how we can practically implement, how other countries have practically implemented. I think the participating corporates, public officials, and students, and especially accountants, I hope will take the message out, take the benefits of this and implement it. As Professor Watala said, what we need is to make things happen. So I think he foresaw this presentation very well. Thank you, Talal, again, to bring an immense, nice experience to this country and to these people. I hope really they will benefit. And thank you also, Mr. Karunaratne. I think he has switched off for participating. Ruchira for handling the question and answer session. Tarindu for handling the IT, and Mr. Disanayaka to be handling the event. And of course, Professor Watawala to organize and bring this message up, and especially develop professional accountants in Sri Lanka, and especially in the public sector, bring qualified people into the public sector to get the real benefit out of this program, not only this, all webinars. Thank you very much for all participants also. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tiril. Thank you, Talal. I think, as we said, I think everyone appreciates it. So we thank you. And then I think some of them would like to have your presentation. So if you can send it to us, certainly we will make it available to them. So thank you, and all the very